Rich, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to see you again, and I appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you and to cover some of the critical issues in real-world evidence. I wanted to get started by asking you, from the decades of experience that you have working in this field, can you cast a critical eye on the state of real-world evidence? And tell us from your perspective how you would describe how well we are doing from the perspective of different stakeholders, like researchers, regulators, payers, and patients. What are we doing well, and what needs to get better?
Yeah, well, thank you, Patty, and thank you for having me on this program today. I really have been looking forward to this. So to start with, let me start with the researcher and kind of work through those stakeholders, because as you point out, they all have a different vantage and probably see different benefits and maybe have realized different benefits, and maybe some are still not quite realized. So for the researcher, real world evidence has opened the door to a far greater understanding of what works for who and at what cost, in actual practice. And we've moved from 2 decades of claims data, may even be more than that, to a better, but still I'd say early understanding of the benefits of clinical and now even omics data. And as that understanding of what I believe is the much greater value of clinical real world data propagates, we're going to see more complex and elegant research designs. And and when I talk to researchers who are working with the data, it's still new for them to be working with EMR data, but they're like kids in a candy store in terms of what they see as being possible. We're already seeing real world evidence help find patients for trials, or to help plan smaller trials, or to project standard of care control arms for patients so that earlier decisions can be made on stopping a drug, potentially saving tens of millions of dollars. Clinical data overall is revealing so much more about biology, natural history, and real world effectiveness. And we're getting data from ever larger sample sizes than could be traditionally collected. So that's the researcher. For the regulator, I'm going to use a metaphor they may not like, but the real world evidence is a bit like a wild horse that needs to be tamed. I mean, I'd say that regulators in the US, have invested in real world data, particularly for safety signal, think Sentinel, and in some oncology use cases, think rare conditions, and for large diagnostic studies. But it's only been in the last 2 years that they have outlined what the saddle needs to look like for manufacturers to ride that horse towards a submission. And I think there's still a lot of confusion as to what regulators will accept for post-marketing purposes, for newer expanded labels, et cetera. But the FDA in particular has been making that increasingly clear, and they are using real world evidence. As you know, the FDA has reported on its own results, and on the drug side, found that from January 2019 to June 2021, of 116 approvals, 88 included a real world evidence study, and the majority influenced the decision. And by their report, almost half were included in the product label. So I think that's really a lot of forward motion in a relatively short period of time. And if we think about how the FDA views, real world data, it's kind of a three-legged stool. First, whether the real world data itself is fit for use for the regulatory purpose, whether the study design can answer the regulatory question, and then whether the conduct of collecting and analyzing the data meets the FDA regulatory requirements. And I think that's something that we'll come back to perhaps in this conversation and drill into that a little bit more. The third stakeholder is, of course, patients. For many of us, that's the first stakeholder because we're all patients at some level. And I think the promise of real world evidence is to tell a particular patient what their likely path is and what treatments are most likely to be effective for them. And for several reasons, we're not yet at the point where patients are seeing those benefits, but it is coming, and it is coming potentially quickly. And then I think we can dig into the payer a bit. I know you know that space very well. I think payers have underutilized real world evidence beyond their own access to claims data. And yet I believe that they're probably the stakeholder group other than patients that will ultimately benefit the most from it. So there's a lot more to be done there.
So I'm interested, just staying a little bit on the regulators. To
Yeah.
me, my way of thinking with the 21st century cures having been lobbed from Congress onto FDA and to the manufacturers, it seems to me to be a really good example of a partnership that came from perhaps something that wasn't viewed as particularly beneficial, or it was a mountain that was very high for FDA to climb, yet they did in a very iterative fashion and in a way rather expeditiously provided guidance, maybe not as fast as all of us wish, but from a governmental standpoint, they certainly did respond in kind. And the progress that we've made in just 6 or 7 years in a notoriously slow moving industry, to me, is something that we can look upon with favorability.
Yeah, no, I totally agree on that. I think that the FDA, and to some extent the European, the EMEA, have, when we think about that three-legged stool, have made it much more clear how data can be collected and utilized, what validation parameters are going to be needed, and whether the design can potentially answer the regulatory question. I think we're still trying to learn what's fit for use, and that may differ or does differ by different therapeutic areas and different schools of thought, even within the FDA. So there's still a lot of learning to happen, and a lot more case studies that the whole industry needs to understand, what the FDA will view as a fit for use case for real world data in some instances.
I want to pick up on something you alluded to in the patient as a stakeholder for real world evidence. You noted that we are not really there where the patients are recognizing the benefits of RWE. What would there be?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was an article in the Boston Globe just this past Sunday about a book that um, Zach Kohaney, who's at Harvard Medical School, and a writer who's schooled in AI, are working on around like the impact of AI and GPT-4 and things like that, ultimately on healthcare. And they talk pretty eloquently about really being able to drill into the whole body of medical experience and knowledge to be able to discern outcomes. And then if you can measure outcomes, being ultimately be able to predict them for individual patients. That's the holy grail. I do think that's where we're going. Just in our own work, we see that it's true in the use cases that we have delved into, or a number of use cases. And I think that's going to change healthcare as we know it in a much more fundamental way than we have experienced to even understand right now. So that's what I believe the promise is. Still a lot of issues, right? So if everyone's played around ChatGPT, if that's going to give you the hallucinatory experience they describe when it kind of goes off in its own direction, we can't have that in medicine. But you think about the positives and where we can end up with AI, and AI is much broader and more diverse than GPT, but people are associating the two, and at least gives you a sense of what might be possible. I think that's where this data is leading us to, because data is the substrate for AI, and collecting this data means we're going to be able to bring much better specificity as to what each patient will experience going forward. And we all want to know, if we have a diagnosis of a chronic disease or malignant disease or any disease, what our course will be. But even more so, we want to know which treatment we should take, because it's really hard to know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's the opportunity that no longer will patients simply be presented with probabilities of population-based data, but individualized pathways. Very exciting. If there was an area of data, Rich, and its applications that you would say that has the most room for improvement, what would that be?
So of data type, do you mean, or disease area?
Really, it's pretty broad. I mean, is there a disease type that you think is ripe, needs to be developed, or is there a data type that doesn't exist, or it's too dirty for us to make use of it? Cover both
Yeah.
if you.
Okay, sure. So um, a lot of work on the real world data and evidence side has been on the oncology, um, in the field of oncology for a number of reasons. That's where the earliest real world data that was high enough quality to be submitted to the FDA was available. And clearly, cancer is a high area of new drug development and great suffering. But if you look at where the greatest costs are in the US healthcare system, I'm sure this translates to the world, it's in chronic diseases. Autoimmune diseases being a subset of that, but chronic diseases are by far the greatest cost. Particularly as we get older, we live longer, we want to live better. Um, and so chronic disease is an area that I think is underrepresented currently in uses of real world data. It's one of the reasons we focus in chronic diseases. In terms of data types, also an interesting question, we're limited in the use of real world data to data that's collected in routine clinical practice unless we incentivize clinicians and patients to obtain additional data. And so what's being used in routine practice or missing in routine practice is where we'd like to see more data, right? There's less genetic information collected in chronic diseases than there is in oncology just because there's not as many uses for the data. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg with respect to that. But there's less genetics data, there's less metabolomic data being collected than maybe we'd like to see. There's a limit on how much imaging we want to do for patients, but wouldn't it be nice to have that data? So we have that also difference between what we'd like to see, but what's really smart to be collecting. So there's limits there. And another area that I think you and I have both talked about in the past is patient-reported outcomes data. Now that is relatively inexpensive to collect. It provides information on a dimension of healthcare that we don't always think about. And as physicians or care providers, we claim to believe, or we believe that we understand what the patient's experiencing, but we know from many, many studies that we do not. And so that is the available outcomes data that's patient-centric that we need to be collecting more of in a real-world data, real-world evidence framework.
I can never forget a presentation that I sat in that was being presented by the Mayo Clinic, and they noted how important one singular overall quality of life scale was in their decision making. And they had found over thousands and thousands of cancer patients that a 2-point change in that scale downward instigated an entire care team devoted to that patient's well-being because it was a trigger for just a fast and quick spiral downward. And so they had found that the death rates, the willingness to continue to undergo chemotherapy, all of these things were related to that 2-point decrement in their overall scale. And it was just fascinating to me to hear how the clinicians had related to that and were using that data in their care plans every single day. I thought it was an excellent example of how something so simple, so routine had moved from the research side right into the clinical care.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a great example, and I don't know if you're referring to Ethan Bash's work around heroes in oncology, but um, there has, my early career was spent in developing PRO measures, and in the last decade, I led a health and human services effort to standardize patient outcomes across and within disease areas. That's called the Outcome Measures Framework, and most of that work is all available on the AHRQ website and publicly available. PROs were one of the core outcomes we focused on. One of the distinguishable outcomes, relative to clinical response, which is what a clinician measures as how patients responding, mortality, resource utilization. So PROs were right up there as one of the core measures of individual patient outcomes. And we need to look towards that data to collect it more and to collect it more in a consistent time-based way.
Mm.
In mental health, we follow about 3 million patients being managed by psychiatrists, and we see a large number of PROs being utilized, although not necessarily on a consistent schedule. You get so much information from the PROs, both for clinical purposes as well as research purposes. So, my hope is that that gets even more standardized and more implemented into routine care over time.
Let's switch our attention now to how biopharma manufacturers are adjusting internally to improve their delivery and use of real world evidence. Um, I see a lot of information out there promoting an integrated evidence strategy within pharmaceutical companies. And interestingly, while there's a lot of discussion about it, some evaluations by large consulting companies indicate that it really still is just in the discussion standpoint, discussion phase, rather than truly being integrated. But my question to you is, as there is more intent to integrate evidence across the full drug development continuum, are you seeing more alignment with your client organizations in terms of their real world development strategies from the C suite on down to how they're organizing their departments to collect, deliver, and use these data?
It's a bit of a loaded question. So to me, integrated evidence is about using different data sources in a fit for purpose way. And some of those are aggregated data sources, some of those are newly collected information. In some cases, syndicated clinical data or clinical plus claims data might suffice. In other cases, those data need to be linked with additional data sets such as clinical trials, device data, death data, social determinants data to answer the question. And then when real world data for a particular purpose doesn't exist, it needs to be generated, generally by capturing data from source systems like EMRs and providers or patients directly. And that has more cost, but more specificity. And we can talk about that being more likely to be regulatory submissible. As to where different life sciences companies are on the maturation curve for using real world data across the product life cycle and across departments. If you've seen one pharma company, you've seen one pharma company. Like they are all very different in how well they've integrated, how strategic they are across therapeutic areas, and how strategic they are across different divisions of their companies. So, one recent CEO of a major pharma company told me that he's got real world data being captured, purchased by their clinical development organization, and real world data being collected, captured, purchased, utilized by what they call the real world evidence part of the organization. And the two are different camps that do not commingle. And other groups, they have a very unified strategy and prioritization and plan. So I think it's very, very different. And as you say, consulting companies like McKinsey put out a report that really explained in detail the economic value of a strategic approach to real world data across the enterprise. And many have read that, but I think they're in different stages of implementation.
Let's switch now to how you are aggregating data for the type of research that OM1 conducts. There's a lot of discussion of data provenance, and I'm interested if you can comment on how you how you assess the data as fit for purpose, and what you think the future of data aggregation utility is, if this is a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so let's talk about fit for purpose first. So I think about fit for purpose to be, has the data been acquired in a way that yields a high quality data set for the particular question? Does it have sufficient and representative population sample? Can you understand and mitigate the biases? Is it the least costly approach to address the question most completely? As the FDA would ask, has the conduct of the study met FDA regulatory requirements for submission, if that is a purpose like traceability and auditability? So from our perspective, what we think about is leveraging networks. And to dig into that a little bit more, in order to capture deep clinical information in the US healthcare system, you need to go to the providers who are seeing the patients in a consistent way with the conditions that you're interested in studying. In the US, if you're unfortunate enough to have, say, a chronic disease or non-chronic disease, if it persists long enough, you will be referred to a specialist. So our view is, if you create networks of specialists that you can automate the collection of data from their source systems, that's sort of the first step in the chain to be able to have a rich data set that is likely to contain the outcomes on the conditions you're interested in. So by that, I mean, for us, we've set up about 8 different specialist networks in fields like dermatology and rheumatology, or in gastroenterology, focusing on IBD, or in cardiology, or in respiratory, or in ENT, neurology, and mental health. And in these specialty areas, we're connecting to specialists who see patients in a consistent way in general in the US. They're better able to assess for outcomes because that's what they're trained to do. And if you want to ask them to collect additional data, they're more likely to be able to implement, say, an easy score in dermatology than a primary care doc. So that leads to some advantages. So that's sort of step one for data collection from our perspective. But the step 2 and 3 is about, how do you get more broad? How do you extend the data from a clinician seeing a patient to the full experience of that patient, that full journey? And so that's where we want to link in data from medical and pharmacy claims data, where we want to understand more about the patient that may be in their medical record by linking in social determinants of health data. So we look at things like not just race and ethnicity, but income level, education status, estimated FICO score, things like that we have found true differences both in access to care and response to treatment using that kind of information. We want to look at the providers. So we want to understand how the provider who is seeing the patient impacts the outcomes, and what you can learn as a life sciences company about the providers that you want to focus in on to maximize the opportunity for the most effective treatment of patients with your therapies. We link in clinical trials data in some cases to be able to follow patients longitudinally, or medical device data to be able to follow patients with medical devices. So linkage plays a very, very big role in augmenting that core data set of patients being followed longitudinally by specific providers. And within the context of the specialists, we can also introduce the collection of patient-reported outcomes information, and even sometimes clinician surveys are capturing very specific information that may not be captured in routine clinical practice. So that's our model for collecting data. On top of that, we look at what will be the use case purpose of that data. So if that data is going to be submitted to the FDA or another regulatory body, then we need to be able to capture that data with traceability, so the ability to trace every transformation of information that happens now through these automated pipelines, and auditability, meaning that you need to set up the opportunity for an FDA inspector to be able to go to a provider and look at their electronic medical record system and ensure that the data in your database is exactly what was in that EMR in order to complete that audit, if you will. So the fit for purpose comes to bear, types of data come to bear, but in the end, if you're collecting clinical data, it's all about the outcomes, and that's what we want to focus on. And I would say that part of collecting data for us is capturing data well beyond the structured information that's generally captured in many different portals of information, billing systems and so on, and going to the less structured information. So information that is in the clinical narrative, in the clinical note, in the procedure report, in the radiology image report, in the genetics report, to be able to capture that information, because a lot of the key information is now captured in the unstructured notes, because we don't have coding systems for a lot of the information today. So I'd say that's another aspect of what we do, and also we make that technology available to life sciences companies or researchers, government, et cetera, to use on their own for the same reasons.
Do you think that there is understanding on behalf of the life sciences companies as well as the regulatory agencies of what they need to look for from the auditability standpoint? Do we know what we need to make transparent, or is this every new evaluation is a little bit different?
I've only been part of the evaluations I've been part of, but I will say that it's relatively easy for a regulator to audit traceability. And by that, I mean that they become less interested in every transformation, as opposed to ensuring that what they see in the final data set that they receive is the same as what appeared in a medical record system or other systems of record at the provider for that specific patient. So yes, being able to demonstrate the traceability is not purely defined by the guidance documents, other than that you need to demonstrate that. But being able to audit that, I think that's done quite frequently, and so that's pretty clear in terms of what that translates to. I think that the understanding the traceability is relatively clear. What becomes a little less clear is when transformations involve algorithms. So for us, in the work we do, we will transform via algorithms unstructured data into structured text that goes, structured field that could be used in a submission. And that requires really robust validation of those algorithms and demonstrating that those validation reports and information, so it can be repeated and retested if needed, but to demonstrate a lot of information on positive predictive value, negative predictive value, area under the curve, and other things, so you understand the validity of the data that's being extracted from unstructured data for the particular purpose. I think that's much less well understood.
Rich, artificial intelligence, we've alluded to it a bit in the conversation already, but it certainly has the potential to significantly impact data collection, analysis, and interpretation of real-world evidence. How is AI changing the industry from a research as well as a treatment perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an area that I really, I said earlier, I think is going to change a lot of things. But in terms of processing, let's talk about that. So artificial intelligence is enabling us to extract more from clinical records. And by that, I mean leveraging unstructured data or images or pathology slides, et cetera, to capture standardized information. So that we'll call that extraction. So that's one area that artificial intelligence is really important. and we're leveraging things like large language models to make that extraction more and more efficient. And there's many companies that will focus on specific image types, whether it's lung images or MRI spine images, to be able to read those more effectively. So that's one area. Another area that we're really excited about is something we call outcome estimation. So I'll give you an example. When you see a doctor, say a neurologist is seeing a patient, they will measure something called the EDSS score. Sometimes the EDSS score gives us an assessment of the disability level that a patient is experiencing, and it's used as an outcome measure in clinical trials. Payers look for this outcome measure in comparing different therapies for going on their formulary, and so on. It's even used to help discern in patterns between different subtypes of MS, progressive or relapsing, remitting, etc. The EDSS takes a while to collect because a neurologist needs to sit across from a patient and go through a series of tests to administer it. What we have found is using artificial intelligence and these language models, we can take a comprehensive exam that a neurologist has performed with a patient, and they perform them regularly, and estimate the EDSS score, even if it hasn't actually been reported in the note or in the EMR. And we've done that using this large language model algorithm, and in doing that, we're able to estimate these scores, but now have many, many more scores, 10 to 15 times, sometimes up to 20 times the number of scores available for an individual patient's record. And these are validated. We publish all of these models and their validation in different peer-reviewed journals. But I think that changes the paradigm both for research, because you have more outcome measures, and also for clinical practice, because what happens for the clinicians is we're starting to feed these outcome scores back, is they did everything they should have done in the exam, they just haven't collected the result. But now they're able to go back through records over a long period of time, look at their populations, and understand the aggregate outcomes with many, many more data points along the way. So we've done this in MS, we've done it in rheumatoid arthritis with CDI, we've done it in mental health with PHQ-9, we've done it in cardiology with the New York Heart Association classification, and so on.
That's really exciting, and it harkens to what you said about the PROs playing a much bigger role. I can see that we can also reduce the burden on the patient if we're able to use AI and aggregate some of the other measures without forcing them to complete long outcome scales. Certainly Congress is engaged in evaluating some of the unexpected consequences of artificial intelligence. Are there any unexpected consequences that we should be on the lookout for using AI in our areas of research?
Yeah, it's a timely question, right? So there are a couple of areas that we really do need to watch out for. So one is bias, and this has come up as you know. There was a major payer was cited for using a model that was biased and was affecting folks with a different racial or ethnic background differently than others in terms of decisions that were being allowed or granted forward within that payer. And that's raised a lot of concerns about the AI models themselves. And I would say that AI models will echo the data from which they're constructed. There's no question about it. So if the data are biased, you're going to see biases in the AI models. And the way around that is to have as broad a data set as possible. It's why we've created a data set with 300 million people in the US, and check rigorously that it's representative in as many dimensions as we can so that we can try to avoid some of that bias, which definitely will occur. The second thing is, we hear a lot about, this chat GPT, and now we're starting to see chat GPT run amok in certain encounters. And the lesson there is that you can't just use one modeling approach to get to medical grade types of AI, and you need to be looking at things that will explain the black box. We actually have a patent on explainability, which is using a alternate set of algorithms to try to explain what's in the AI box, and then you can have that kind of reviewed by clinicians, and they say, yeah, that makes sense, that doesn't make sense, before you kind of leverage an AI model. And many of these AI models, for particular purposes, they're going to be for treatment purposes, will require going through software as a medical device requirements with the FDA as a further check on their validity.
So explainability, that's an interesting term. I assume that's like a subset of validity in a way, or a slightly different take on validity.
It's so imagine and we have an article where we did this in Fabry disease. So if you take a disease like Fabry disease and you are trying to predict whether or not a patient might have underdiagnosed or undiagnosed Fabry disease, what the AI will do is tell you, here's the probability and the likelihood, and you create a cutoff where you're going to say, yes, I think that's high enough probability that I'm going to go ahead and genotype this patient. What explainability will do is it will take the signals that the AI is seeing and present those signals in a way that can be consumed by a clinician. So you'll see a signal, a high density or a deeper color on a chart of certain neurologic symptoms or gastroenterology symptoms or other factors that you can then dig into and say, is what it's telling me as from a signaling perspective consistent with what my medical knowledge or what the literature says? And so it's a different dimension in terms of trying to understand what the data and the model derived from the data is telling us.
Mm-hmm. Whether it's clinically relevant, I suppose, in the interpretation. Very interesting. Let's go to some rapid fire responses.
Okay. Be kind here. Okay, go ahead.
I always am, as are you. Rich, what are we going to be talking about if we were to have this conversation about real-world evidence 5 years from now?
It's a really good question. So I think we're going to look back and say, how was it really utilized in different scenarios for different stakeholders? And that will be, I made some presumptions here as we talked about it. I said, well, I think the FDA, we're going to see more use cases. Is that going to be true? And where will those use cases start to congregate? And where will the prevailing wisdom of regulators about certain things needing a randomized trial versus what could be, where you can use a trial plus real world evidence, or can you use it for post-marketing surveillance, but not a superiority claim? That will become more clear over time, and that will be something we'll be talking about. I think we'll come back and talk about whether payers really seize the opportunity to use real-world evidence and AI to move towards value-based care in a much more real way and not just sort of a very incremental way. I think the biggest question will be, did we see patient care improve, either through more rapid approvals of drugs and devices or withdrawal of drugs or devices that were proven not to be working or might, not to have safety concerns? Have we seen a much greater use of real world evidence and data to actually look at the regulatory framework and act in a more of a continuous way. And then we'll ask whether or not we actually saw this movement towards using AI based on real world data in clinical care. And that's what we'll be talking about. How far did we come in the 5 years?
What do you think is your best example of how real world evidence has actually improved patient outcomes?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. So going from data to action that improves patient outcomes is still a challenge. So we use real world data as the substrate for something we call Phenome, which is an AI application that provides personalization tools. And in a randomized trial that was conducted by Dell Medical Center, they showed that patients who used the personalization tool based on Phenome that we call Joint Insights for surgical decision making around knee replacement had statistically significant improved outcomes over those educated in a more conventional way. So that is one example. Another would be that any drug approval based on real world evidence has likely improved patient outcomes. And I think your listeners are likely familiar with the approval of Ibrance for male breast cancer that was based on several types of real world data. So that's a good example also.
I found it very interesting with the hydroxychloroquine case that resulted in the journal article being withdrawn from Lancet. Certainly gave us some insights into some of the challenges with data provenance and validity of those data. But perhaps a slightly less talked about issue is whether or not in the review process of journals, if the reviewers are educated enough to adequately evaluate these manuscripts. And here's a quote from the New England Journal of Medicine spokesperson who was interviewed, and he or she noted, "We have limited experience with reviewing or publishing studies like this one," referencing the Australian real-world evidence study on hydroxychloroquine. And he continued, "which used a large database based on electronic medical records. The reviewers and editors asked the authors questions about the data sources and data validity. The editors accepted the author's responses rather than asking for help from reviewers with expertise in this type of data. In the future, our review process of big data research will include reviewers with such specific expertise." Can you comment on that statement?
Yeah, I think it's a very accurate statement that working with large data sets of EMR data is different than working with more traditional standardized, structured field-based standardized coded systems like claims data sets or electronic data capture collected data sets. The data sets are very large. They're transactionally based, and where we think of things in terms of patient journeys, we need to translate a transaction into a journey. And so there's a lot of subtleties and there's a lot of places where bias can be introduced. So I do think that that's a very smart statement that they're going to need to have reviewers who understand those subtleties.
And I'm sure you do as well. I sit on a number of journal editorial review boards, and it is a constant struggle for us to build out these review boards to have the expertise that one needs. With several of the areas we've discussed, they're such fast developing areas, and they're also maybe being developed outside of the traditional medical arena. To me, it's just a real industry and publication division challenge of how we bring the right people on to serve in a peer review capacity, so that we're all partnering together for better quality information.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. There's so many journals, and then there's a lot of journals that are, I don't even know where they arise from. Looking for reviewers,
Mhm.
it's hard to get a strong reviewer pool for journals that are not top tier journals. I think it's a challenge, particularly around more esoteric topics like real world data, big data, AI.
Mhm. Continuing our rapid fire questions. Area that needs real world data, but it doesn't exist. What is that and why doesn't it exist?
I think one area that needs more real world data, and it doesn't really exist to the extent that the stakeholders would like to see, is actually medical device world. Medical device world needs more real world data for many reasons, understanding and improving their products and meeting regulatory requirements, both specific post-marketing needs and newer, like the EU has new device requirements that absolutely require real world data. So, and in some ways, medical device manufacturers might actually benefit even more than their pharma colleagues in that medical devices are undergoing even more frequent iterations and new designs. But
Mhm.
unlike drug codes, medical device codes are not well tracked by providers. So that makes it more difficult to differentiate certain devices from each other when using real world data. So we've actually had to develop several approaches to overcome these issues for medical device manufacturers, to actually get specific product level information to be able to use with real world data to make it useful. So that's one area where I think it's still underutilized.
What about the arena of pediatrics? How are we doing in that area of our demography?
Yeah, pediatrics is interesting for a number of reasons. I think in pediatric oncology, there's more data than perhaps some other areas of pediatrics, and part of that, I'd venture to say that most drugs, other than in oncology, go for indications in older populations, more adult populations first. And so the drug development spend tends to be there. And so when you think about real world data and markets for real world data, there's more of a market currently for real world data for adult indications. As uses become more mature, I think we'll see more efforts to bring pediatric data on board. But the other challenge we have with pediatric data is a lot of it, in pediatric diseases represent rare diseases, and rare diseases are more identifiable. And so you have more challenges with the identification. And so there's a number of reasons why pediatrics has been slower to get there. We'll say that the American Academy of Pediatrics is now moving forward with an effort to develop a network of data collection that will generate real world data in the pediatric space. So
You mentioned earlier in discussing the different stakeholders in the state of the union, so to speak, of real world evidence. What do you think? What do you wish that payers could understand about real world evidence that they don't right now?
yeah, I unfortunately think that payers should be thinking about real world evidence as a driver for personalization and improvements in care quality and cost in ways that they have not considered at all.
Hmm.
And that's because they generally work with their own data, and it's generally not very clinical. It's more claims based. And I think besides patients, they may actually be the biggest beneficiaries in terms of cost avoidance and improved value based care. So I think they are missing the boat a little bit,
Hmm.
but hopefully they'll catch up.
The last question I have for you today, Rich. What are you most excited about in healthcare that we aren't talking about enough?
I'm actually going to touch on two things. So one, and we didn't get an opportunity to talk about what the other transformation that's happening around real world data that groups like ours focus on, which is automation. So what we're doing is connecting systems of record within medical systems, within health systems, within practices to automated ways to extract the data, bring it in on a continuous basis, which enables real world data to become the platform upon which other evidence generation, including trials and other types of evidence generation, can eventually occur with much lower burden to providers and to patients. But in terms of what's most exciting, I think that the combination of real world data and AI for personalizing healthcare that we've talked a little bit about for patients and treatments will be far more revolutionizing for healthcare than most people think and talk about. More than talk, I would like to see more implementation, because the results we've seen, in cases like identifying patients with Fabry disease or treatment-resistant depression or hidradenitis suppurativa, or understanding what their risk is for high-cost utilization or for likelihood to respond to a specific treatment is almost magical in some use cases. And after many years in the real world data space, it's why I still look forward to coming to work every morning.
So why don't you give me some examples of how technology is changing real world data application and use?
Yeah, so I view technology as one of the most important trends in real world data evidence for collection, analysis, and use. So from one thing I mentioned earlier is that development of networks, again, networks of specialists who are most likely to record outcomes, but also integrated delivery systems, and in creating automated ways to connect to EMRs creates this new paradigm. The second is leveraging unstructured data, and think that the same seismic shift we're seeing in moving from Google to ChatGPT, we're seeing in going from natural language processing to large language-based medical language processing, and validated, repeatable use of clinical narratives and reports will become the norm. In terms of analysis, we had talked about technology like artificial intelligence enabling us to extract more from clinical records and even to make estimations. And then in terms of use, leveraging AI for personalized medicine is going to be a big area. And I think that we also want to see technology used to bring those capabilities back to patients, not only in provider settings, but at home and in telehealth and other settings as well.
Can you draw a picture for me and the listeners of what that might look like at the patient's bedside with this predictive pathways and based on the artificial intelligence of large databases? How is it going to be used by the doctor and with the patient?
So we see two use cases emerging right now that I think won't surprise you. So one use case is really the website, right? So that a patient can go to an internet-based site, whether that's in kind of a chat format or enter a little bit of data format, as people try to take control of their own healthcare and enter some information about themselves or give permission for a system to obtain their medical record and get very specific information, like I described in Joint Insights, as to what their likelihood is to benefit or have risk from a specific procedure or treatment. And we're doing this in like rheumatoid arthritis, where we can identify for a specific patient their likelihood of improving if they're treated with a certain class of drugs versus other classes of drugs, and it differs by their history and their subtypes and other characteristics. So that's one way. The second way, which actually I think is a harder path, is actually getting clinicians to implement it. So clinicians are slow to change their workflow, but you can think of it like ordering a test, where the way you obtain the information as a clinician as you basically complete an order form within your EMR, and the system scoops the patient's record, the key variables from the patient's record, and returns through an API a result back into that EMR. And so we're doing that in some of these programs as well. And again, having the information both to the clinician at the point of care, as well as being archived in the record, are key. But we really do like the fact that we can get the information to the patient as well, so they can use that as more of a shared decision-making model. That's how we see it being.
And what are the physicians saying to you in your network? Love it. It's okay. How much trouble?
First thing, yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is like a little bit of shock and awe that it's possible. And then the second question is, how do I implement this in my workflow? So like, how do I really like this. I really want to do this. I want my patients to have this. How do I implement this in my workflow? And that's like the hard part of getting it to work through workflow, that you almost have to go through use case by use case in some cases.
And that's a whole different division of a company too, I would think.
Right, exactly.
Well,
We
Rich.
work with partners, yeah.
Oh, that's good. Yes. Well,
Yeah.
Rich, I want to thank you. It's always just such an honor and a pleasure to have a chance to sit down with you. I learned so much.